the seas were just awful, super steep, breaking for a couple hundred feet in each direction, and the boat was just thrown all over the place.
Welcome back to another Maritime Medical interview. This week we have renowned solo adventure sailor and author Mr. Randall Reeves. If you don't know Randall and you didn't spend 2 years of your life losing sleep at night reading his blog, here's the gist of it. The project was called the Figure 8 Voyage, and it involved sailing out of San Francisco, passing Cape Horn, and circumnavigating via the Southern Ocean route, returning back to Cape Horn, looping up and over the Americas, through the Northwest Passage, and back down to San Francisco. Having met Randall at one of our courses before the voyage, I followed his blog like a hawk, and after repeated knockdowns, dozens of gales, and the boat having 26,000 miles under its keel, it was time to come home. He ended the effort, and back to the boatyard he went. I was glad he made it back alive, but what I didn't expect is that he would fix the boat in the next few months' time and attempt the feat again, this time completing the circuit after more than 36,000 miles and a solo transit of the Northwest Passage. Just an incredible feat, super inspiring. I was really happy to catch up with Randall and meet his faithful boat Moli back in San Francisco and ask him some questions about the trip.
Catastrophic failure approaching Cape Horn. During knockdowns, I had catastrophic failure in the Indian Ocean where we got knocked down, broke a window here in the pilot house. My name is Randall Reeves. I'm from San Francisco, California, and I've been sailing since about high school. My family bought its first sailboat when I was a freshman in high school, about 70 miles upriver from here on the San Joaquin River, just outside Stockton. So I learned to sail on the river, which is perfectly flat, brown as the River Jordan, and about 500 feet wide. So tack, 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 downwind, tack, 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 downwind. But man, it blew my mind. I was amazed. My father was a merchant mariner, so I'd heard about boats and ships my entire childhood. But high school was the first time I ever got on a boat.
What kind of boat was that?
Hunter 30, so flat out production boat. No fancy stuff at all. But it was a lot of fun. I knew pretty early on that solo sailing, single-handing, was going to be my thing because I started, quote-unquote, borrowing the boat when Dad went out on his work trips away from home. I got as far south as Antioch one time, and then one time when he went away for the whole week, I took the boat all the way down to San Francisco Bay and tacked back and forth in front of the Golden Gate Bridge for a bit, thinking, oh man, how cool would it be to go out? Didn't have the guts. Thought I was being really slick too. Thought Dad never knew I'd ever taken the boat. But Dad's boat was one of those where everything had its place, and his teenage son didn't always remember exactly where that place was. And so I only learned much later that Dad knew I was going out, and let me have at. That was really great.
What was your first boat that you purchased?
I purchased a Columbia 24, old, raised cabin, sloop-rigged, full keel, tiller steered outboard motor, older than I was, boat. First boat, I think I bought it for $1,500. Did nothing to it but sail. And then I don't know how it happened, but I sold it for $2,000. I thought, oh, this boating thing's really cool. You can make money. Yeah, that's never happened again. That particular ratio of purchase to sale price. Great little boat. Didn't have standing headroom, didn't have a head, and didn't have heat. So it was lacking some of the niceties of life, but it was a good bay boat, a great boat to learn on. I had a lot of fun in the bay on that boat. My second boat was a Mariner 31, ketch rigged. I thought it was a fiberglass boat when I bought it. This is an indication of how much I did not know. A Mariner is actually a fiberglass hull with plywood decks, plywood house, and box construction Sitka spruce masts. And I had made the mistake of thinking that plywood that is covered in one thin layer of fiberglass roving is fiberglass, and only discovered a couple of months after I purchased the boat that the decks were rotted through. But by that time, it was too late. I had been reading Metissier for years at that point and was in love with Joshua. And there were some aspects of this boat that reminded me of Joshua: catch rig, full keel. And so this was my little Joshua. By the time I realized it was the wrong boat to have purchased, I was in love, and it was too late. I spent 10 years learning how to rebuild that boat with a lot of help from a lot of people, including a Japanese boat builder that I flew over from Okinawa and flew him over on airline miles because I'd been doing a lot of flying for work at that point. Put him up in a little apartment in San Rafael, and we hauled the boat in San Rafael. Worked on the boat together for 3 months, rebuilding the decks and the cabin sides. Learned a ton from him. His name was Iki. And I love that whole process. I say to my wife all the time, I don't think I could have done the figure eight voyage if I hadn't made the mistake of buying that boat that required that I rebuild it and learn all that stuff associated with, epoxies and wood, and learn all that stuff of taking care of a boat. I never would have had to learn that if I hadn't bought the wrong boat.
Okay, so what were some of the first safety lessons you learned, being it the hard way or otherwise?
I think one of the first major safety lessons I learned was at sea on the Mariner 31. I went all the way around the Pacific in that boat solo from 2010 to 2012. That was my first really big passage-making experience, and it was great. And after a few months of doing this, I was really comfortable on board, really comfortable moving around deck, and I got to where, quite frankly, I wasn't as religious about the harness as I had been initially. And we learned a lot of safety lessons from books and in classrooms on shore, and sometimes they don't always feel all that applicable at sea. And this was one that I had let slip. And I recall distinctly, I was sailing from Hawaii back to California. This was in 2011, after the Japanese tsunami. In 2010, it pulled all that debris into the ocean, and I was cutting right through this debris field. It was a lot of fun. Just tons of stuff, and I was cataloging it for one of the universities in University of Hawaii, and I wasn't tethered, and I had been searching for a particular type of debris, something with Japanese kanji on it that I could prove was actually Japanese. And I remember I was going really slowly. We're in the high. There's almost no wind. And I've tacked around several times trying to get this little Japanese rice bag. And I'm leaning over the side. Each time we tack around to come up next to this little Japanese rice bag, I'm leaning a little further over, and on my third try, I actually catch a wave just right, and I fall off the boat. And I'm not tethered, I'm not clipped in. I've got the harness on, but not going to do you much good if you're not attached to the boat. And I tell you, I almost walked on water. The scuppers on that boat were just within reach, and I leapt. Boat was only going maybe a couple of knots. I nearly leapt out of the water to get back on board, and heart was racing for probably an hour after that. But that was a really good lesson of, there's this practical bit of information that you read about, that you've learned in class, that you've sometimes employed, and here's your first concrete experience of why it's a good idea to wear a harness. So that's probably my first really good experience of that.
Good. What was your last experience of that?
And of course I had to tell everybody about it. That night's blog was like, oh, I fell overboard. I think my wife almost flew to my position in the middle of the ocean and slapped me upside the head. I remember reading a book called Northern Lights about a couple in a Joshua that went around the U.S. And when they took on new crew, the first lesson was just don't fall overboard. Just don't do it. Stay on board. Practice 2 hands and 2 feet. I know for myself, when I'm working the foredeck, it's always 3 points of contact. Right. Maybe 2 feet and a knee, or 2 feet and a hip, or 2 feet and a hand. You got to have contact with the boat.
And also staying on your feet. So many people get on their knees and they relinquish their toes in the traction of their feet.
Yeah.
And now they're sitting on deck versus being active with their feet.
And that's really hard.
Yeah.
I don't really understand that. That particularly, I think, is problematic for reefing the main when you've got the winch underneath the gooseneck. So you have to sit down, wrap the winch, and then...
Sit on your butt?
Yeah, that's tough.
Yeah.
If the boat's moving around, that's really not a great position. So I actually rigged it so that I take that reefing line, the Jiffy reef line, back up to the winch that's on the starboard side of the mast, let it feed in there so I can stay planted where I was. So I've done most of my sailing by myself. And almost all of my passage making has been solo. When I first departed San Francisco on the first figure eight attempt, I practiced the same measures that I had always used for making crossings. So I've made a couple of crossings from San Francisco to Hawaii or Hawaii back to the States, 28, 30 days on a slow boat like mine. And I'd always slept in 60-minute increments. 60 minutes below, set the alarm, come up on deck, look around, make sure the boat's going in the way it's supposed to be going, everything's fine on deck, then back down below, sleep for 60 minutes, come back up on deck. And for a quote-unquote short passage of 3 or 4 weeks, that's fine. I'd never done anything differently. But I noticed, actually, figured out after a few weeks, that that is not a good solution for months at sea. I left San Francisco for Cape Horn, and on about day 45, headed down to Cape Horn, I was beginning to feel really bad. I was hallucinating, felt like my knees were coming undone. I felt light in the head, and it finally occurred to me, I'm not getting enough sleep. I've been doing this 60-minute cycle. This has always worked for me in the past, but I'm not getting enough REM month over month. So I switched at that point from 60-minute sleep cycles to 90-minute sleep cycles, which gives me a good chunk in REM sleep. And I did that for the remainder of the 2 figure eight voyages. And although it's not, I have to say, a great deal of fun to have to get up every 90 minutes every night for months on end, I felt like I could have subsisted indefinitely on 90-minute sleeps. But it was that interesting transition from, hey, this has worked for me in the past. This is the kind of thing I've done, say, in bay sailing. But now I'm outside the bridge and I'm headed to Hawaii. I need to kind of rethink some of my strategies. What's appropriate for inside the gate may not be appropriate for outside the gate. What's appropriate for here to Hawaii may not be appropriate for here to the Horn. Stuff like that.
Yeah, that 90 minutes. That just brings me flashbacks of a week or two with a newborn.
Oh, man.
I almost gave up. I don't know if there's any mistakes that you see the beginning sailor or intermediate sailor make along that journey to get to where you got.
A couple of things stand out. I've had very few interactions with sailors because I've done most of my sailing by myself. But I've had some situations where I'm coming back into the dock after a weekend on the hook here in San Francisco Bay, for example, and the guy at the dock, who I know sails every weekend, but only ever goes out to tack in front of the Golden Gate Bridge and come back in, asks me, my goodness, man, you were anchored out all weekend? How on earth do you do that? How can you actually, don't you have to have anchor rode gear that's at least the displacement of the boat? I mean, it's not safe otherwise, right? And you look at him and you go, well, I don't know why you think that. And I think the point there is trust the gear, trust the process, and trust the boat. I think some of the most dangerous times sailing are the 10 minutes from getting on board, cutting the lines, and getting off the dock, getting back on the dock, or that few days between the coast and really getting all the way out to sea. You'd really be surprised how beautiful and even and easy, quote unquote, easy it is to sail on the high seas once you get out of the influence of the coast and the coastal refraction of the seas. But you've got to relax a bit. You've got to remember that all that practice that you've engaged in, all of that reading you've done, all the courses you've taken, and the boat you're on are really suited for what you're doing. You've got to trust the gear. I think that's the mountain climbing phrase. You get up on the rock, and you have to trust the gear because that's the only thing keeping you alive. So trust the boat. I've had so many experiences where it just feels awful getting off coast. I'm almost seasick because the sea is terrible. But the boat is handling it just fine. The boat is not nearly seasick. The boat is great. And after a few days, you get out on the ocean and everything feels in a groove. So trust it. Trust the boat. Let it take you where you want to go.
Sure. And with that, I mean, you spent what, years on this boat, or 6 months refitting it, ready for this voyage? So
This boat?
Yeah.
I bought the boat in 2016, spent the winter refitting it in Homer, Alaska. It was in Homer when I bought it on the hard, spent the winter up there. And then my shakedown cruise was San Francisco, sorry. My shakedown cruise was Homer to Port Townsend, across the Gulf of Alaska. Port Townsend to Hawaii and Hawaii to home, about 7,000 miles solo. My biggest challenge with this boat was it was big. It's 45 feet, it's 40,000 pounds of boat. Big rig for me. I'm not a big guy. So I really felt, especially since I was headed from here to high latitude south, I needed as much practice as I could get. I've watched a number of solo sailors set off on a world cruise, having done a shakedown cruise from San Diego to San Francisco. And you just don't know from that what you're going to encounter. I did 7,000 miles on this boat solo before I headed to Cape Horn. I still got beat up. So the more time you can spend offshore practicing with your boat, if you're launching on a really big endeavor, the better. Give yourself time. Build that into the plan to get offshore and really get engaged with the boat. I've watched this several times. And, lucky for us, 3 weeks from here is Hawaii, so you can always pull in if you need to. But, yeah, it's really kind of amazing.
Your concept of time and space and what's close by is very different from probably 99.9% of people.
Important to realize that you just can't know it all. I remember reading Bernard Moitessier's remarks relative to Adlard Cole's heavy weather sailing book, that first really excellent heavy weather sailing analysis book. And Moitessier's comment, this was after he'd done a ton of offshore sailing, he said one of the things that he liked about the book most was that it didn't try to answer the questions, it just posed the questions with possible solutions. This is coming from a sailor who's already been around the world at least once. And I found that really remarkable because that is really the key. Nobody knows it all. Nobody's sailed in every condition, and the conditions you will encounter at sea are complex. So know that you have the facility to think through problems and take on problems on your own, and don't rely on other people to give you the solution. But take joy and fun in being presented with the solutions that you don't know the answers to and that you could figure out on your own. That's half the joy of sailing offshore, is being presented with this daily challenge of, oh my goodness, I don't know how to solve that. But I've got a boat and I've got stuff on it and I can figure it out. Well, I've done 90,000 sea miles in the last 2 years, and so I think that's a difficult question to answer, because pretty much everything is broken at some point. And that's kind of the wonder of the experience, is when you're at sea for a long time, almost everything will fail in some way or another. But I think one of the major failures for me was in round number 1, the first figure 8 voyage. I had gone into the experience planning to sail through everything, even the super heavy weather. I was going to keep going on the instructions from Dumas and Moitessier, who had followed that tactic. So I recall distinctly getting into some super heavy weather south of the Crozet Islands in the Indian Ocean, about 46 degrees south. We'd been through a number of gales by this point. It was probably February of 2018. We'd been through a number of gales by this point. It was probably February of 2018. I'd been at sea for, let's call it 5 or 6 months. We'd been in southern high latitudes now for at least a month and a half. We'd seen some pretty bad weather, but I still didn't know everything. And I didn't know how to adjust my tactics and adjust my thought processes based on the information I'm getting from my surroundings. I remember we got into a super big gale, winds 45, 50. It wasn't the biggest wind velocities we'd seen, but we were in an area of the ocean where there was a bit of a continental shelf coming up right below the Crozets, and there was Oglehouse Current coming down from the South Africa. And the seas were just awful. Super steep, breaking for a couple hundred feet in each direction, and the boat was just thrown all over the place. I could not figure out how to make the boat safe. I was thrown down, we were knocked down 3 times over the course of 6 or 8 hours. Part of the problem is at night when it's raining in big seas, you just can't see the sea. You can't figure out what the attitude of the boat should be toward the sea because you can't see it. But the other problem was, I learned in hindsight, was that I wasn't going fast enough, strangely enough. Safety and speed are synonymous in a heavy displacement boat at sea. And I had said to myself that I would sail through all the bad weather, but what I had failed to do was maintain speed. I was in a gale that wasn't as big as we had seen, wasn't as high wind velocity as we had seen. I was running just a storm jib. We're coming to the tail end of it, where the seas have clocked around, the wind is clocked around. Wind is 35, 40. Now the pressure of the wind on the sea state is lifting. Seas are getting bigger, but the boat is not going fast. So the rudder doesn't have all the strength it needs to make the corrections it needs. I didn't put that together. I didn't figure that out. The reason we got knocked down was because I wasn't flying enough sail. I had put the storm jib up thinking, great, I'm going to leave that set through the course of it so that I don't have to go to the foredeck, because being on the foredeck in conditions like that is frightening. But that wasn't what the boat needed to be safe. So that was a big lesson for me relative to safety at sea, was adjust your tactics based on the situation rather than what you anticipated in the situation, or rather than what will make you the most comfortable. It's all about making the boat comfortable, not you comfortable.
I've noticed in your blog you mentioned about running off, and on the second attempt you were keeping more speed. You were keeping more sail up on your second round.
Yeah, intentionally, based on that incident in particular.
What kind of sail set would you fly on this boat for, a gale that came through town? Would you keep head sail?
Well, so the adjustment I made in the second figure-8 voyage attempt versus the figure-8 voyage attempt was that I left the storm sail in the bag. I didn't fly it one time. We had the same kind of weather. We had the same gales. We probably had more of them because we were in the south for far longer. But I took everything on the roller furling number 2 jib. And I did that for 2 reasons. One was, as I said, speed is safety in a heavy displacement boat like this. So, and what is absolutely frightening is to be surfing in a 35 to 40,000 pound boat, to be surfing down this monster sea where you're kicking out your own swell of 15 feet on either side of the hull, and the boat is roaring, going 15 knots for this couple of seconds. Frightening as hell. But we did that in a number of gales, and the boat was safe. The boat could correct. The challenge I had in that first gale was, by the time I got to the bottom of the sea, but into the trough, the boat had lost way and couldn't steer. And so coming up into that next sea, we get cocked around and thrown down. Whereas flying more sail, going faster, there was more ability to correct when we got to the bottom of the sea. And I won't say that we never got knocked down during the second voyage. We did. The Indian Ocean is still tricky and still tough, but the boat never felt in danger like it clearly was during that first round. I had catastrophic failure approaching Cape Horn. During knockdowns, I had catastrophic failure in the Indian Ocean where we got knocked down, broke a window here in the pilot house. Didn't have those problems on the second round because I had learned to adjust tactics to the situation.
And so this boat must sail well down swell. It wouldn't round up and broach or anything like that. Your monitor could hold it in a relative alignment.
Yes. The monitor needs help, though. The monitor does not steer with the same, what's the word for this? The monitor does not steer as aggressively as a human would in the same position. So you have to balance the boat much more thoroughly. And that's another reason why speed over the rudder is so important, because you're not getting that angle of attack on the rudder as that you would if a human was at the wheel.
Are there any commonly misused, underutilized pieces of equipment that could have prevented an emergency? One
of the most commonly underutilized, if it's ever used at all, pieces of equipment that I found on the few other yachts that I've sailed on is the Sextant. Almost every boat I've ever crewed on has a plastic sextant in a cupboard somewhere, and I've never met another skipper who's even had the thing out. So he's got this navigational tool on his boat, which he intends to use in crisis. He has no idea even how to aim at a star. So I've had a lot of fun with celestial navigation. I'm not an expert by any means, but I've done it many times now on many passages, and it's a lot of fun. It is hugely satisfying to be able to pinpoint your position at sea to within a mile or so, just using this mechanical device and a couple of lookup tables. It's amazing to me that sailors who crossed the ocean as late as 1980 had to know how to use a sextant to make the voyage. And within that last 40 years or so, people like me, we've just lost that skill. And I rely as much as anyone on the chart plotter. It's on 24/7. I love it. It's an amazing piece of equipment. But equally as thrilling is that sense of self-sufficiency you get from practicing celestial navigation. It's not that hard, and it's a lot of fun. I used Tom Cunliffe's Celestial Navigation book because it was the smallest book on celestial navigation I could find. There are plenty of books that are long and go into grievous detail on every type of shot you can imagine. Tom Cunliffe's book focuses on everything you need to know, and he steers away from the arcane stuff you don't need to know. It's plenty confusing as it is, especially if you're on your own and you run into questions you can't answer just from the book itself, but it's an awesome book. I actually always have it with me, and even now, this is I've probably been on 6 or 8 passages now where I've used the Sextant, used celestial navigation. I still find myself consulting that book.
What is the one thing or one of the things that you would never leave the dock without?
So, as a solo sailor, the one technology that's fairly recent that has absolutely changed things for me is AIS. I mean, if you read any of those old sailing books of the guys who are on their own, even if they're not on their own, people who are sailing across the ocean, the biggest fear is not really the impending gale, it's getting run over by something. And so AIS, which gives me VHF to chart plotter position and speed and course of commercial traffic on the ocean, is just a godsend. I still only sleep in my 90-minute shifts. I still come on deck and check things out. But to have that security blanket of knowing almost everything at sea, I think now is AIS equipped. Even a lot of the fishing floats you find out in the Pacific in particular, you'll get an AIS hit from them. That's a great relief. If I'm headed to high latitudes, which is my favorite stomping grounds these days, one of my favorite safety devices is the Jordan series Drogue. I've used it now probably 5 or 6 times on the figure 8 first and second attempts. And I have found for me, as I've said, my goal is to sail through everything, to just sail through all the heavy weather. That said, there are times when you will be presented with a sea state or a situation where you just can't solve it. You can't figure out the right attack on the sea or the right sail configuration. It's just overwhelming your boat. The Indian Ocean for me is a good case in point. And I have found the Jordan series Drogue, which I call a stopping drogue. It's that drogue with the drogue line as a bunch of tiny cones over the course of 200 or 300 feet, brings the boat to an almost perfect stop, is a massive safety tool. I've used it in anger, as they say, a couple of times. I've used it in situations where the seas are so steep that the drogue is actually pulling the stern of the boat through the wave, keeping it upright and keeping it safe. And I trust that piece of equipment implicitly, with the hope of never ever to use it, but still, it's an amazing piece of kit.
And so how's it been retrieving it? Is it impossible to retrieve?
Retrieval is a bitch. And one of the biggest disadvantages of that tech is that it's hard to deploy. It's dangerous to deploy, and it's difficult to retrieve. And so what happens is, because you know that, you wait until it's way too late to actually deploy it, and then you deploy it. When it's the most dangerous, it works. it's hard. I've done it enough now that I feel fairly comfortable. I've tried a couple of techniques. The technique I used on the old Drogue that I had was to run a line from the big winch in the cockpit along the side deck to the bow through a big heavy block there, and then back to the Drogue. Crank, a couple of rolling hitches to the Drogue, and crank the Drogue up to the bow, lay it on deck, move the line back, and just do that. It's a long, tiring process, but that is fairly easy. The problem with the Jordan Series Drogue is if you're cranking it aboard in the winches, the cones get caught in the self-tailing technology on the winch. The problem is that any modern Jordan Series Drogue is going to be Dyneema, unsheathed Dyneema, and I have yet to figure out a knot that will grab that and hold onto it. I've tried it a couple of times. The rolling hitches in series, Prussic knots, they all slip. So for me, the easiest thing to do is just take the line directly to the big winch, fire up the engine, put yourself just in dead slow reverse, not enough to actually go backwards, but to bring the boat to more or less a stop, so that between the big seas, the Drogue will come, it'll power on and power off and power on and power off, and you can hand over hand the line in 6 or 8 feet on each swell. And it's still a long process. It takes a couple hours to get that thing in. It is no fun. But if you figure that device is for the boat, for when the boat is in a situation where you've lost control, you can't solve the problem of how to make the boat safe. Deploy the Jordan Series Drogue and the boat will be safe.
And so as a stopping mechanism, would you ever consider putting it off the bow? I know it's not designed to be off the bow, but just to keep your bow into the seaway.
Do you know Matt Rutherford?
I've heard of him. He's up in the high latitude as well.
He's a high latitude solo guy. Matt Rutherford sailed around the Americas in 2010, 2011 solo. Boston, through the Northwest Passage, down around Cape Horn, back to Boston in 300 and some days, in an Alban Vega 27 that was not anything like new when he bought it. He had new sails, and that was about the only thing new on that boat. I'm amazed that thing was floating by the time he got back. It is not a boat designed for the Arctic. It is not a boat designed for Cape Horn. But he made it work. And there were times, in the Arctic in particular, where he had contrary winds, a contrary gale, and he would spend time in a very large fjord on a parachute anchor off the bow. He'd drift slowly to the other side of the fjord, pick it up, sail back through the sail back, parachute back out, and do this couple. So he's a big advocate of a parasail, of a parachute sea anchor. I've never used one. I cannot imagine spending time launching a device like that off the bow in the kind of conditions you will be in when you need to deploy a device like that. It makes no sense to me. But they clearly work. They've worked for lots of people. Not a device I'm comfortable with, not a device I feel I need since I have what I have. The Jordan Series Drogue, to answer your specific question, is not designed to be run off the bow. We call it a stopping Drogue because on this boat, and typically it will reduce boat speed to 1 or 2 knots, but my guess is that's still too fast for an off-the-bow solution. My guess is that a parachute anchor off the bow reduces your speed even more. But I've never felt the need. I will admit to you, it is pretty damned uncomfortable to be pooped because your boat is not making any speed. And these massive seas you're taking are going 15, 20 knots, right? So you're getting slammed. And so I can see the argument for launching something off the bow. But I've never felt unsafe in that situation off the JSD. And I just don't see any reason to go to the bow in the first place if you've got a device that's designed to go off the stern.
I'm just curious as to, on this boat, I realize every boat is different. And heaving to has been, that timeless tactic to do in a heavy sea. You didn't have to heave to, and you were seeing 40, 50 knot gusts at times. Yeah. Maybe higher. But do you think heaving to would even be a successful endeavor at those types of wind speeds?
I think that's an excellent question, and I'm not really sure what the right solution is. to go back to my remarks about Bernard Montessier, reading Adlard Cole's Heavy Weather book and saying it's an awesome book because it presents solutions to problems without saying what the right solution is. I think that seas, heavy weather is so complex. Everything is moving massively that different boats will react differently. And it quite literally, I think for me and this boat, it just took practice to figure out. I have hove to in this boat. I have not hove to in heavy weather in this boat. I've never been really comfortable with the angle of attack. So if we say, let's say I've got the jib blade over back and a storm jib and a triple reefed main, even with that configuration, the tiller lashed over, I'm looking at 45, 50, sometimes 60 degrees off that approaching swell. By the time I get into weather where I feel I need to heave to, that kind of an attack on the sea is not any good for me at all, because I'm in seas that are already knocking me down. So being at that angle to an approaching sea is terrible. The first figure eight taught me that lesson pretty powerfully. I was in the South at the same time that some friends of mine were down there, different boat, different segment of the course. I had gotten beat up horribly south of the Crozettes, knocked down, broke the rail, broke the window, had to put into Hobart in the Indian Ocean. And that's when I used the Jordan Series Drogue for the second time. And that was what helped me weather the last part of that tremendous gale. My friends were about a month behind me, and in the same quadrant of ocean, got into the same problem, same kind of heavy weather, stacked up seas like I was experiencing. And their skipper, in a 50-foot catch, did what he had always done, and which had always worked for him in high latitudes. He hove to with a triple reefed main. It had always worked for him. They were raked. Boat was laid over. It stripped the dodger off the boat. It took lines over the board. It broke all kinds of stuff on deck. Because that's the kind of seas you're in when you're in the high south. So I still think, for me, the tactic I am most comfortable with in this boat, just sail through everything. Safety is speed. My second experience on the figure eight made me comfortable with that idea. That isn't to say that I can't get into situations where the boat is just simply overmaxed. But if you get into that kind of a situation, I think heaving to, under any circumstances, puts you at risk, because you're not maintaining a perfectly perpendicular attitude toward the seas. And I think that's critical when you finally get to that position in the gale where the boat can't handle it under any other circumstances. Heaving to in that off angle position, I think, is asking for trouble. That said, the very maligned heavy weather tactic of lying a hull, I think, gets a bad rap. I've used lying a hull a couple of times, and not extreme weather, but heavy weather. 35, 40, good heavy seas, but nothing that would really endanger the boat and cause it to roll. And there have been several times, like when I lost steering off Cape Horn, I had to hand steer this boat into Ushuaia for a week. I'd steer during daylight hours, 12, 18 hours a day. By the time we get to sundown, I am just wiped out. I don't have the energy even to heave to, right? So I just lay a hull, trying to hold position. Winds were west, driving me right toward Bahia Cook, so I wasn't worried about being driven off position. I just needed to rest, so I just lashed the tiller and lie a hull all night. And you get banged. There are times, the boat will get thrown up on the sea and wham, get thrown over, but not knocked over. I found it a really comfortable way to ride. Again, this is a heavy displacement boat, old style, full keel. That may not be a great tactic for a fin keel boat. I don't know. I don't know that technology. But if you read the heavy weather literature, it's all about never, ever, ever, ever lie a hull. And that's just not correct. Lying a hull does have its advantages.
Knowing what you know about this boat, it seems like you guys have found a nice rhythm together.
Oh, yeah.
a nice lifestyle. Would you ever consider a different type of boat?
That's a great question, actually. I'm definitely not done sailing this boat. I graduated to Mo, like a true high latitude expedition monster. This boat was built for Clark Steed in 1989. His goal was to sail around the Americas, Germany, Northwest Passage, Cape Horn, and home. And he went to Dubel and Jesse, which was a Norderney, North Germany, all aluminum boat building yard. And he said, I see you build all these fun, nice yachts, very, very nice. What I need is a tractor for where I'm going. Simple and strong. And so that's what we've got, right? This Mo is a tractor, and she's awesome in that regard. Just bulletproof. I proved the windows aren't bulletproof in the Southern Ocean, but everything else is great. So I'm not done taking this boat into harm's way, because that's what she's designed for. So Clark Steed, who did circumnavigation of the Americas, Tony Gooch, who did high latitudes in this boat for 13 years, went to the Antarctic Peninsula, went to Svalbard, circumnavigated solo nonstop in 2003. Ann and Glenn Bainbridge, who went through the Northwest Passage in this boat, and then Randall doing his figure eights. The boat has spent almost all of its life in high latitude, so I'm very interested in going back in this boat. That said, some of my friends have been taking off around the world in sleds, and according to life at my speed, my boat prior to this had a 25-foot water line, so 100 miles a day was just peachy. And so in this boat, when I go 140 miles a day, I think, wow, that's fast. I think 170 miles a day is my best day. My friends right now, they're doing 240-mile days. And I'm thinking, wow, that's cool. I'd love to go that fast. So I've never sailed anything faster than this boat. I cannot imagine the difficulty that attends trying to keep a planing boat of 45 and 50 feet long upright, or staying sane on a boat that pounds like a ski boat. Just can't imagine that. But I will admit that there is some attraction to that. One of my favorite pieces of technology on board is the Grib weather file. You just think about it for a moment. Before about 15, 20, 25 years ago, the best you could do were text files or verbal weather forecasts over the single sideband or ham radio. That was all you got. And now I can pull at hourly intervals Grib files with wind feathers down to, I forget what exactly the quadrant is, but I think it's like a 25, 30 mile radius. I mean, it's just incredible, the amount of weather information that is available to the person going offshore now versus not that long in the recent past. And I have spent a lot of time, you get to where you're rather addicted to pulling a Grib file. You'll pull it in the morning, you'll pull it at noon, you pull it in the evening, and you'll study it. And you will absolutely plan your day and plan the next several days around that Grib file. It's a lot of fun. And in a boat like this, what you find if you're in a heavy weather zone like the Southern Ocean or the North Atlantic, North Pacific, you find that, there's no way you're going to outrun anything. At 140 miles a day, I'm moving at probably, a third of the speed of the average fast-moving low. But you can see them coming, and you can position yourself more advantageously within that approaching low. There were many times in the South when I'd see something coming, and I'd be down at 49 degrees south because I'd had a beneficial run of days. And I'd see, like, 4 days from now, I'm going to get hit. So I'd hoof it back up to 45 degrees south, or maybe even a little bit higher, to get into a more beneficial quadrant. My goal was always to be in that quadrant of the low where the wind forecast was for about 35, because you figure 35 is going to be at least 40, gusting 45 or 50. And I can handle that, but anything more, and it gets really dicey. So no, you can't outrun anything, but you do have initiative. You do have agency. You can move around within that storm system that's approaching you. And the Grib file is the lifesaver. I mean, without that Grib file, you would simply be overtaken. You'd watch the barometer and you'd know, okay, we're getting hit, but you wouldn't know where it's coming from or what the actual intensity is or how you should position yourself relative to that weather system. The Grib file really answers that, and it's a godsend.
With an approaching low, where are you trying to position yourself as it's coming?
My goal in the South was to position myself in that upper quadrant of the low So we're in the south, right? In the south, the lows are spinning clockwise, and they are typically most intense on that eastern, northeastern, southeastern quadrant. So my goal was to get as far away from the center as I could, and specifically to target a zone where I saw the wind was forecast to be about 35 knots. What I found was the gribs are, they're never accurate, but they're really highly suggestive of what's coming your way. So if I get a forecast of 35 in my quadrant, I figure 35 to 40 is the kind of wind I'll see with gusts of 50. And I wouldn't say that's comfortable, but I feel that's where the boat can handle things quite easily. So that was the goal. It's always to hoof it north, try to get into that northern part of the low where the wind was not light by any means, but negotiable.
Nice. Any standout medical or near medical hardships that you experienced, and what did you learn from them? I know in the figure eight you had a number of sort of minor injuries.
Yeah.
But
I think going into the figure eight, medical incapacity, whether it was a broken bone or some kind of poisoning, was one of my biggest fears. Because even now, it's one of my biggest blind spots. So I've taken first aid courses. I've taken your course. I've learned what I would think to be quite a lot relative to what I knew, which was zero. My sister is a nurse, so I set off with just a blazing beautiful first aid kit with all kinds of drugs. But you're still by yourself, and even if you have crew aboard, you're not getting out anytime soon. So it was one of my biggest fears, and frankly, I was fortunate that although I experienced a number of minor accidents, I never had to tap into the drugs, except for high dose ibuprofen to help me with some swelling, and I never tapped into the first aid kit, even rarely at sea for bandages, because you're wet all the time and the bandages doesn't stick to anything. So you just gotta put a cloth around it and bleed out for a while, and just gotta wait until everything clots up. But I have taken. I remember being on the foredeck once in really heavy seas. I was working with the storm jib, and I thought to take a fancy dance around from one side deck to the other side deck. And at that moment, the boat kicked up and then dropped out from under me, and I flew. I mean, if I hadn't had a hand on the boat, I would have flown overboard. I was really still amazed. I landed on the deck, but I came down on a chain plate on my hip, just hard, like wham. And I was in such pain. I thought I'd broken something for several seconds. I just stayed on deck. I was afraid to even try to move. As it turned out, I couldn't sit for a couple of days. I'd bruised my tailbone so hard. But after a few days, it was a bruise, and that was it. And then one other near miss accident for me was in dealing with the Jordan Series Drogue. It can be challenging to deploy once you feed it over the side, and once the cones start to grab water, it goes out at boat speed, and there's just no stopping it. And on my second deployment, I had been very careful, but I had somehow gotten the lead wrapped around one of the winches, and it was already beginning to load up at this point. And if it loads up, I'm hosed, right? It'll be on that winch until the wind backs off. So I quickly reach down and try to, like, trip several times. I try to trick it over the top of the winch, and my hand gets caught in the Drogue and gives it a fast twist, and it was swollen, God, 2 or 3 times the size for a couple weeks. Didn't actually, I don't think I broke anything, but that was super dangerous. I mean, if I had gotten fouled in the Drogue, I would have been pulled to pieces, because the Drogue feeds through a little 1 foot square area of the rail over the aft quarter. I would have been towed through that 1 foot square.
I was always worried because we see all these exacerbating factors, like this went wrong, then this went wrong as a result, then this went wrong. And hypothermia is one of the main ones, where people become sluggish, they start to make poor decisions, and then they take a fall, or they make a decision that
totally
exacerbating. And I remember reading something on your first figure eight where you might have gotten wet or cold or just tired. I think it was probably a combination of exhaustion. I believe, if I remember, it was the first series of knockdowns by the Horn. And you were talking about some way to keep warm. I can't remember what it was that the nurse in your family had suggested that you, like, pee in a bottle and keep the urine close to you, or it was I don't remember what it was. Do you remember what that was?
It was definitely not that.
You were not drinking your urine at that point. Warm liquid.
I've seen a few sea miles, but I haven't yet been tempted to drink my urine. No, I can't. I actually do have a hot water bottle that I would use sometimes in the South. So I have heating on board, but I never use it at sea. It's a gravity-fed diesel heater, and I think it might actually work in a heavy sea, but I've never tried it. I just toughed it out. It's cold enough that you get sleet and snow sometimes. I'd say ambient temperature in the South is 45 degrees down to freezing temperatures occasionally. So it's not super cold, but you're on a boat, right? So it's super wet. Even if you're on a dry boat like Mo, I don't have that deck to hull leak that so many boats that are fiberglass have. She's dry below, but then I'm coming below and I'm always wet. So after a couple of months of dragging your wet gear below, even if you're careful and try to keep it in the doghouse, you just get wet everywhere. And so you're wet, the boat's wet, where you sit is wet, your sleeping bags are wet. It's really hard to maintain body heat. I would find that within a couple hours of getting out of the sleeping bag in the morning, my feet and my hands would be cold, and they would just be cold all day. After a while, you just get used to it. This is the way you live. You're cold all day, even when you're, wrapped up in everything you've got. But I did learn a trick. The other thing I learned was, especially when you're only sleeping in 90-minute stints, if you go into the bag cold, you never warm up. You're not there long enough to warm up. So the biggest trick that I learned in the South for getting warm at night, I never learned how to get warm during the daytime, but for getting warm at night, what I would do was make a very, very hot dinner. Typically, I would cook 2 meals so that I would only have to cook every other day. But in the South, you're eating a ton of calories, and so I'd cook those 2 meals, and I'd eat both of them. And that heat going into your body warms everything. I mean, suddenly your hands are hot, and your feet are hot. And wow, I mean, that's paradise for that brief moment. And that's the time to hit the bunk. That's the time to go to bed and try to get some sleep while you're warm. Because you're warm. If you're warm, your body heat will heat up that bag rather quickly. So that was the only trick I ever learned. It's tough.
Any gear recommendations or things that keep you warm and dry?
Say that again?
Any gear recommendations for things that kept you warm and dry?
I use... I forget what this is called.
Capline?
No. Merino.
Merino wool.
I live in merino. I do wear cotton at sea, like undershirts. I find them to be fine until it gets cold, and then that cold moisture against the body really hurts. So I have merino wool t-shirts, merino wool base layer, secondary layer, and then fleece tertiary layer. And then down too. I don't wear down on deck, but I have down for the cabin. Down is just luxurious. And you work on deck, you get bleeding cold, come below, strip down a bit, put on a big down jacket, which you never take on deck. It always stays below. Put on a big down jacket, and even if you've only got like one layer below it, you're steaming in a bit. So that would be one recommendation. A lot of people say that merino wool is scratchy. I found that it was only scratchy for a while, and the trade-off between scratchy and warm was a fine trade-off. The other thing, a lot of us try this, and it's just really difficult, is you try never to take the wet stuff below a certain part of the boat, like leave the wet stuff in the doghouse. That's just, sure, do try to do that. It's really challenging. One thing I did do was have fleece boots, Uggs, actually, Ugg boots, girly boots, not pink, but close to, that I only kept below. I'd come below, I'd strip off the boots and the socks and go into those Uggs. And that helps. I mean, you're still not really getting warm, but there's no warmth in a rubber boot. Even if you've got beautiful, thick merino wool socks, the rubber is just too cold. I have insulated extra toughs plus, and extra large. I wear a 10 usually. The boots are size 12. I can hardly walk in them. But one thing I've learned about boots is if there's any pressure on the foot at all, it cuts off the circulation. So make sure the boot is actually too loose to wear comfortably walking from here to Starbucks. You're not walking to Starbucks. You're only going on the foredeck at the most. So make sure the boot is big and loose and can hold in warm air if it ever gets access to such a wonderful commodity. Rubber boots, they're great. Keep your feet dry, but not warm. Ugg boots are great.
Yeah.
Absolutely fantastic.
Planning and preparation. I mean,
I feel like I got to experience that, right? I did the first failed figure eight, and I got that. Oh, yeah. So I could talk about that, but.
Well, what are some of the things that you were satisfied with your preparation attempt? I know you had these really intricate spreadsheets of caloric intake and ingredients that you brought, raw ingredients and propane and all this stuff. What are some of the things that went well and some of the things that you would have redone on your first attempt?
Okay, yeah. Are we rolling?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. I, even on the second figure eight, and this is relative particularly to provisioning, I overshot my willingness to prepare wonderful meals. And I under-anticipated just how tired I would be after 6 months of nonstop sailing. So, for example, I never take fresh vegetables on a long cruise because I find managing fresh veg really challenging. I end up throwing most of it over the side just because I never get to it. It's too, for me, not for other people necessarily, but for me, it's just too hard. So by the time I got to the first and the second figure eight, I'd already, blown out the whole fresh vegetable idea. But I had budgeted one baked loaf of bread a week. Man, there is just nothing quite so delicious as fresh baked bread, butter, and jam. Man, it's just intense how that, even just the smell, even if you don't get to eat it, just being able to smell it takes you right into heaven. And I was using 1 hour no-knead dough and yeast. I made it as simple as I could. But even that, where I was sailing, it was hard work. And I overestimated my willingness to participate in that process. So I think going into future, specifically high latitude cruises, I want to really focus in on more and more simplicity. Keep it simple, stupid. So for example, relative to provisioning, I'm just, especially solo, right? I'm just not going to cook difficult stuff. But rolling that idea out into other parts of the boat, sail management, technology on board. I already have a very simple boat. I don't have a fridge. I don't have a freezer. I don't have electric pumps on board. The most technology aboard right now is the chart plotter and the autopilot. The autopilot is almost never used because I sail in the wind vane. So that's great. That helps a lot. Fewer things to have to service, fewer things to have to worry about. But I'm sure we can take that further. Like one of my fantasies for the next couple of passages is to lose the electronics. I am not a Luddite. I love electronic gear, but I also enjoy the experience of doing without it. And although I've used the Sextant quite a bit over the years, I've never had to rely on it. I've never actually turned the chart plotter off for more than a day. It's really great practice to actually use the chart plotter and position yourself and then see where the chart plotter said you were at that time. That's a great way to practice. But I really strongly want to turn the thing off and try it with just the mechanical technology. But I think for me that I learned a lot from reading a book called The Thoreau of Sailing, I think. I can't remember if that's the exact title, and I can't remember the authors. It was written in the 70s, I believe. And what I remember distinctly from that was when you're passage making, remember the key priorities are floating, steering, going, staying on board. And maybe staying on board is the first of those. But the point is, it's really basic stuff. It is, as long as you can steer the boat, raise a sail, and have a general sense of the direction you should be going, you're good. So focusing on the big core systems and leaving off the frills, I think, is a great way to go.
It's interesting. It reminds me of emergency medicine, where you've got the basics, airway, breathing, circulation, all those things are intact. You have some time to figure stuff out.
Yeah.
Yeah. And we always teach back to people, especially when things get hectic, is just to go back through those basic systems and make sure that there's a good plan in place for those things to continue, and kind of cycle back and check back in with that often. Yeah, no, I mean, that's the future of medicine, is telemedicine. That's what you're doing at that point. Telemedicine, and that's probably going to be with humans forever, and that's the trajectory. COVID just accelerated it by 3 to 5 years of development, and it's great. What we're teaching now is how to make telemedicine benefit you by still doing your full assessments and making sure you're asking the right questions, so that when you do relay what you've got, that you have those little detail points that can actually go with it. Which goes back into that application that I'm building to help telemedicine help you. Yeah. And also help yourself. Because it's hard. I mean, it's hard to get the right information. Yeah. And get it out there and describe what is actually happening. But anyway, I digress. The question we were talking about was,
I think that was it. What did I have to say?
Yeah, we were talking about things that you were happy with your preparation style, and or if there's anything you would do differently in the future. And I think you answered both of those. So I guess the final question is, and we've talked a little bit about it, but what's next for Randall Reeves? It's not. I suspect it's not land lubbing.
Well, we'll see. I'm currently engaged in painting the exterior of the house, which is about as not sailing as one can go. It's not great fun compared to being on a boat. I had never spent any time in high latitudes at all prior to the figure eight voyage attempts. I had been dreaming of the Southern Ocean since I was a kid. I had the privilege of meeting Bernard Bottessier when I was in high school, and that really kind of lit a fire under me. But I had never been south of Tahiti before I launched for the first figure eight. And so I would say between the first figure eight and the second figure eight, I have probably spent, well, the better part of 2 years in high latitudes for those two attempts, about 90,000 miles all told. And I've been bitten pretty hard. It is so amazing to be down there and up there where the territory is so raw. So it's damn cold when you're in the Southern Ocean, and it's frightening because you're absolutely exposed. There's just no running. There's no place to hide. But once you've gotten over that, you begin to really start having a good time. And there are places to explore. There are a great number of high-latitude islands at about 50 south, 45 south of Crozetts, Kerguelen, South Georgia, Cape Horn, the Antarctic Peninsula, and I didn't see any of that, right? I went screaming by everything at my 6 knots. So one of my goals is to spend more time in the south, to maybe do another circuit of the south, and to try to arrange to stop at some of the high-latitude islands. I would love to do that. They're all owned by countries other than the U.S., and they're all cordoned off by scientists, but with the right permits, one can have a go at some of the islands, and I'd love to spend some time down there. I'd also like to overwinter in the Arctic. You know what? One thing you get this sense after a while of going day after day after day for months, even though you're barely going running speed, you just get the sense of going so fast. You just want to stop. After a while, being becalmed in the doldrums is delicious, right? He's not moving. It's quiet everywhere. So I have this extreme desire to sail somewhere extremely remote and sit out a season. Right now, I've got a couple of places pegged in the Canadian Arctic, but due to COVID, it's closed off probably for, I'm going to guess, another full season. but there's some on the Northwest Passage from the last figure eight. Saw some just incredible spots. So we'll see. That's the medium term goal for sure.
Nice. A question just occurred to me. If you could go back and see yourself in 2016 prepping for figure eight one, and is there any piece of sage advice you would give that person as having done not one but two figure eight voyages and all the lessons you learned?
You cannot practice enough. I'm just amazed at how naive I was going into the first figure eight. I had sailed, I probably had 25,000 blue water miles at that point between this boat and the little ketch that I'd sailed previous to that. And I knew I was vulnerable because I'd never been south of 25 south, but I didn't know how vulnerable I was. And it's a big place. You get to 56 degrees south where Cape Horn lives. There is no good time of year. It's like one season is lots of gales and they're strong, and the next season is lots of gales and they're less strong, but they're still gales. And my figure was that we faced a gale a week on average during the 3 months from Cape Horn to Cape Horn during that second figure eight. And I can't say, although I did get to the place where I had a fair sense of what we could handle and I had a larger comfort range, it's big down there. And you're always vulnerable to some catastrophic failure. Somebody said to me that at many points during the figure eight, the crew of the space station were my nearest neighbors. So that's pretty remarkable. They're not launching a dinghy to come save me anytime soon. So I know a lot of guys who've taken off on big cruises after not really doing much of a shakedown cruise, and they've done some sailing and they've gotten used to the boat a little bit, and they're just going to wing it. And sometimes you don't have any choice but to do that, given your own logistics, time constraints, and stuff like that. But more practice. I did, to my credit, crew a Northwest Passage prior to trying it by myself. That was a huge factor in success, because it's a gripping experience. But I did not take the time to try the South under circumstances that weren't by myself in my own boat. I didn't crew a leg, Argentina to South Africa or something like that, and that would have been smart to do. But we learn how we learn. In truth, as you well know, more than half the fun is the planning and the learning. If you didn't like facing situations you didn't know how to solve, you would never, ever go to sea, because you spend most of your time trying to figure out how to solve something you've never solved before. And if that's not fun, then don't go, because that's the nature of the beast. We're not professional sailors. We didn't go to sea at the age of 12. So we're all having to learn as we go, all of us. And just the more practice you can give yourself wherever, the more time you can spend trying to think through, okay, what if the wire on the stay unravels? It probably won't, but it might. What are you going to do? And it's just a lot of fun to just make lists of those kinds of things, try to think them through. You can't carry every spare, but by the time you get a certain number of spares, you've got so much stuff on the boat, you can start mix and matching and make stuff work. So it's a fun game.
So not just bring more pairs of underwear and more socks.
I talked to a guy once. You're right. But I talked to a guy once who says, bring a lot of food and a lot of spare parts. And he says, when you've got everything packed on the board, when you've got everything packed on board, throw away the food and take more spares, because it's the spare parts you really, really need. And I'm blessed with a huge forepeak, which is like a hardware store, because this boat has spent most of its life in high latitude, so it's got lots of stuff, and you need it. You really need that, and you need to be comfortable with not doing a professional job. You need to be super comfortable with doing whatever it takes to make it work. Beautiful doesn't count for anything. You're going to be bodgering everything together at some point during a cruise. That's okay. You're only trying to get home.
What tools did you find you used more than you thought you would? I see a vise, right? Is that a vise there on deck?
That's funny. I installed the vise here in the doghouse because this is not only where I live when I'm at sea, this is the workstation. And, you're the boat's mechanic when you're at sea. And I find that, especially since I'm by myself, I just don't have 6 hands. And they never grew out. So having the vise, being able to throw something in the vise, hold it rock solid while I massage it. Like, for example, when you're at sea, the monitor wind vane has what's called a safety tube between the paddle and the frame, so that if the paddle hits something hard, that tube breaks without damaging the actual mechanism. But that means you got to haul it aboard, bring it into the cabin, take it apart. Well, by the time it's got 10,000 miles on that safety tube and paddle, it's about as frozen together as you can possibly imagine. Getting that thing apart is a real job. So being able to throw it in a vise and, manhandle it, that's great. I get lots of kidding from people for my vise, which is super ugly, and it looks like I put it there just to make the cabin look cool and manly. But I tell you, I use that thing every week. It's a great tool.
That's funny. I got a vise a couple weeks ago to install on our chart table. Similar. I also have a stump that I found outside of Bellingham, the San Juans. It was just floating around, and I don't know why on earth we decided to take this stump versus the thousands of other stumps we've seen. But for some reason, we took this big waterlogged stump. It's about this big, and it fit between the cockpit combing and the tow rail, and it fit just perfectly. And now I sit on it with a tiller extension. I can sit up and see over, the cabin top and around the Dodger and all this stuff. And we use it as a tool center, where now if I got to drill anything, it's the backing plate.
Oh, that's great.
Just beating the crap out of this thing.
That's
and
great.
It is my favorite tool.
That's awesome. It's going to be locked up for sure. And I'm not ready anyway. But I think what I might do by way of practice, cold weather practice, is take off this summer, head to Hawaii, and then from Hawaii up into Alaska, Sand Point, and end up for the winter in something I can't think of the name, Prince William Sound.
Yeah.
Right there at the crook where southeast blends into the major part of the state. Big, beautiful bay, huge. Glaciers coming into it. Doesn't freeze over in the winter, but for a California boy, it'll be plenty cold and dark. And the nice thing is, if I pull into Whittier, which is on the northwest side of the bay, I can probably drive pretty easily to Anchorage at any time during the winter. So I'll be home for the holidays and stuff like that.
Yeah.
So not be gone all winter.
Right.
But leave the boat there for the winter, be up there for some part of the winter, and try to prowl around and get used to playing around in the dark and the cold.
Are you thinking on the hook during that time?
I'd like to be able... Yes, kind of.
Unless
I'd like
you need
go
to
out
leave
during the winter when it's obviously if I freeze in the Arctic, I'm not going anywhere in the winter.
Right.
But I would like to get out a bit in the winter and just really be out in the cold. I mean, the thing about the Arctic over winter is that I just don't have any concept other than my reading of what that cold is like.
Yeah.
Yeah, I went through the Northwest Passage this last summer, but it's between 45 and 60.
Yeah.
degrees Fahrenheit, and that it feels cold, but that's nothing compared to 60 below. So I'd like to get a sense of what it's like to be in truly cold weather in this boat. The boat's well insulated. I've got good heat, but I don't have a good sense of, other than a few months in Homer when I first bought the boat. I don't have a really good sense of what it's like to be on it when it's really cold.
Well, thank you for your time, Randall. I appreciate it.
My pleasure.
And that was
fun.
fascinating.